Hello everybody, this is Dr. Aparna. Today we are going to study The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, written by Mark Twain. This book was first published in England in the year 1884 and later on it was published in the year 1885. Commonly named as the Great American Novels and also known as the boys' novels because this was actually written for young boys. Of course, later on it was critically acclaimed and people really appreciated what was written because the novels have a lot of hidden meaning to it. It is a critique on the society that prevailed during that time. This novel is actually set in the year 1830s and 1840s, but as I said, Mark Twain wrote this novel much after that, though the setting is in the earlier times. What he is trying to establish through the novels is there wasn't much change in the society from 1830s to the time when he was really writing this novel. Now, this novel is famous for its vernacular language which he uses and the local color regionalism in the language that we can see. It is told in first person and it is narrated by Huck Finn, who is the main protagonist of this novel. Huckleberry Finn is the narrator of the two books that Mark Twain wrote, the first one being Tom Sawyer Abroad and the second being Tom Sawyer Detective. The book is noted for its colorful description of people and places along the Mississippi River. It satirizes the Southern society. It actually talks about the problems that existed in the South at that point of time. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is often considered as one of the greatest books written in American literature. It is actually a critique on the attitudes and the people that lived in the South. Let me just give you a brief account of the story. The story revolves around a young lad called Huckleberry Finn and a slave called Jim. Jim and Huckleberry Finn run away from their respective places of residence because of certain problems. Huck escapes from his father, who is a drunkard. Jim, who is a slave, escapes because he is under the impression that he would be sold to another set of people. So both Huck and Jim, they start their journey down the Mississippi River, and as they move south, they come across a lot of adventures. Jim is actually moving towards freer states and Huck is helping him to move towards freer states because he wants to do something for Jim. This entire novel is about how Huck tries to save Jim and the kind of adventures these two lead. So, in the very end of the novel, we realize that actually Jim has already been set free by Miss Watson, who was his owner. We also come across a lot of social criticism in this novel. Mark Twain tries to tell us that the traditional values in those days had their flaws. Huck is brought up with the same traditional values. He is under the impression that the black slaves who were working in the cotton fields are mere commodities. But as he travels along with Jim, he realizes the kind of person Jim is and eventually does look up to him as a parent. So, this novel talks about the transformation of Huck from a person who is tied down by the traditions and values of society to a young boy who starts thinking on his own and realizes that whatever he has been following all these days or years is not entirely true and that he should follow his own instinct, he should follow his own mind so that he can find happiness. Let us now move on to the first module and read about the historical background of this novel. The novel is set along the Mississippi River during 1830s and 1840s. This region was still a frontier region. That is, this was not a very developed region. This land was sparsely populated, very few people were living there. Most of the people depended on the land for their livelihood. That is, they were either into farming, hunting, fishing, or trapping. Industrialization was still at its early stages here. There were few schools in Missouri, Illinois, Arkansas, and Mississippi. Most children attended these schools just to get the primary education and to be able to read and write. In the 1830s and 1840s, the northern states abolished slavery. This was also the time when new states were created in the western territories. As I said earlier, northern states had abolished slavery on moral grounds and also because they had practical objections. Southern states always had slavery because the southern states were rich in cotton cultivation. They needed people to work on these farms. So they got people from Africa, and slavery was a common thing in those days. Due to this, there was a conflict between the northern and the southern states, which finally led to a civil war in the year 1861 under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln. Whatever be the case, all Americans who were residing there at that point of time, who were whites, never had a good opinion about the blacks. They always considered them to be intellectually and morally far inferior to them. Racial beliefs, attitudes, and behavior that would be considered reprehensible today were very common in those days. In the next module, we're going to learn more about Mark Twain. Samuel Longhorn Clemens, born in the year 1835, better known as Mark Twain, is considered as the greatest American novelist and also a humorist. He is most noted for his novels Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. He wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer in the year 1876, followed by The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in the year 1885. He grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, which would later provide the setting of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. He apprenticed in the beginning as a printer. After toiling as a printer for many years, he became a master riverboat pilot. Later on, he gave that up and went to join Orion. He went as a gold hunter, but there he failed and he jumped back into journalism. While a reporter, he wrote a very humorous story called The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, which became a very popular story during his times. He received a lot of critical acclaim. He also wrote travelogues which were appreciated by the people. He achieved great success as a writer and as a public speaker. His wit and satire earned praise from critics as well as peers. He was a friend of the president, the set artists, the industrialists, and also the European royalty. Twain was born during the time when the Halley comet made its way, and he predicted that he would go along with it as well. He is lauded as the greatest American humorist of his age, and William Faulkner has called Twain the father of American literature. Let us now discuss the major themes of this novel. The first one is the racial discrimination and slavery. Even though Mark Twain wrote this particular novel long after slavery was abolished, yet he set it around 1830s and 1840s when slavery was still prevalent. All that we read in this novel reflects that even though slavery was abolished, the same conditions prevailed during the time when Mark Twain was writing this novel. So there wasn't much of a change in the society even after the abolition of slavery. So the conditions that prevailed in 1830s continued to do so after that too. The next theme that he really talks about is the moral education of Huck. Huck is a young boy who learns a lot in life as the novel proceeds. He becomes more aware of the society around him. The novel depicts his maturation and his development as a human being. He is a young uneducated boy who is taken in by Mrs. Watson. She looks after him and tries to educate and civilize him. But then, as we read through the novel, we realize that he lives in a society that is not really very good to him. He faces a lot of trauma and trouble. He has a father who is a drunkard and who beats him up. Even though he does not wish to stay with him, he is forced to go with him because that is what the judge wants him to do. So the society as such does not show a sympathetic attitude towards Huck. More than once we see Huck choose to go to hell. That is, it's a society that talks of the blacks as if they were commodities. So in his adventure, we see that he tries to help a slave called Jim from slavery. He helps Jim to move away from slavery. And while doing so, many times he feels that he would go to hell because according to the custom in those days, slaves were treated like slaves. They were treated as commodities in the house. Nobody gave them any importance. They never had any value. So Huck was brought up in that kind of atmosphere. So when he was helping Jim, he always felt that he was going against the traditions of those days. And that is the reason why he felt that perhaps he would go to hell. But then he never listened to the traditions. He listened to his own conscience, and which proved to be correct, which proved to be true. So that is exactly what Mark Twain tries to tell us through this particular story, that it is better to rely on one's instinct, it is better to rely on one's conscience rather than follow the beliefs and traditions of a society. The next major theme that Twain is trying to explore is the hypocritical society. Definitely it is a society which demarcates between the whites and the blacks. This faulty logic appears early in the novel when a judge in the town allows Huck to stay with his father. Because when we start reading the novel, we realize that Huck and his friend Tom have actually got a lot of money, and Huck's father, who is actually a drunkard, wants that money. Even though he is a drunkard, the judge does not look into that aspect and says that Huck should be looked after by his drunkard father, who is incapable of really looking after him. Huck, of course, escapes from his father and he goes further down the river, and his adventure starts with Jim, who is a slave, who is a runaway slave. At the same time, we also come across Jim, who is a slave with Miss Watson, and when he overhears that he would be sold, he too escapes. Both Jim and Huck meet, and so they start moving towards freer states. Huck wants to save Jim, and Jim has no other way but to go with Huck. Twain is trying to tell us here that it is impossible for a society to be just, especially when no matter how civilized they proclaim to be, they look after slaves just as commodities. Motives are actually recurring themes and structures that occur in this novel. The first one is Huck's childhood. Now, Huck is a young boy. It is possible for him to change because it is an age and the time when things can be impressed on his mind. He is open-minded about anything that comes to him, and therefore his opinions towards Jim, towards the society, change according to the adventures and according to the experiences that he faces as the novel progresses. We also see falsehood and deceit in this novel. As I was telling, both Jim and Huck, they move down the river Mississippi towards freer states. As they go down the river Mississippi, they face a lot of adventure. They come across people who are treacherous, who are deceitful, who are con artists. Of course, two of them whom they meet are the Duke and the Dauphin, that I'm going to speak about in detail later on when I tell you the story. At the same time, Huck also tells lies, but then these lies are harmless. For instance, there is a time when Huck tries to protect Jim because people are hunting for slaves that have escaped. So he tells the people that Jim is actually suffering from smallpox, and he tells that Jim is actually his father. People get scared and they move away, and before going off, they give some money to Huck. It is then he realizes that it is okay to lie as long as it does not harm others. So these kind of lies are something that we come very often in the novel. The next motive that Twain talks about are the superstitions. So there is traditional religious belief as compared to superstitious. There is this comparison, that contradiction that exists. Jim is highly superstitious. He looks at the bird and he can tell what kind of weather is there. And very unknowingly, he talks about signs that he sees and tells whether the signs are good or bad. Huck, who is with Jim, dismisses Jim's superstitions in the beginning, but later on he comes to realize that Jim has a deep knowledge about life around him, and he starts to appreciate that. Jim's superstition serves as an alternative to the accepted social teachings that are ingrained into Huck. This provides Huck a capacity to think for himself, and he realizes that what all he had learnt was not necessarily true, and he starts looking at Jim from a newer perspective. The next motive is the stereotype aspects of popular romance novels. Huckleberry Finn is full of people who set their lives on romantic models and stereotypes of various kinds. For example, Tom Sawyer, who bases his life on adventures and actually endangers the life of people around him. We also come across the Shepherd's Sons and the Grangerfords, who believe that they have something against each other and they go on a shooting spree. This is obviously a bizarre thing that happens. Twain actually finds humor in these situations, and he tries to make fun of these situations. Twain shows how strict adherence to romantic ideals can be very dangerous. In the next module, we are going to read about the major symbol of this novel, which is the river. For Huck and Jim, the Mississippi River is a symbol of freedom. But as the novel proceeds, we realize that it is not really a symbol of freedom. It is one symbol which sets them free for a brief period of time before they get into another problem. So, in the beginning, both of them are happy that they are moving down the raft. Both of them are happy that they can be what they want to be and what they wish to be. But alongside the Mississippi River, they come across various towns and places where they do face a lot of problems. Alone on the raft, it is freedom for Huck and Jim, because Huck is actually escaping from a tyrannical father and Jim is moving towards freer states. Despite their freedom, however, they soon find out that they are not completely free from the evil influences of the people who live on the banks of these rivers. Early on, the real world intrudes into their lives. In the beginning, the river starts flooding, and Huck and Jim come into contact with criminals and wrecks, and they also steal goods from a ship. Then, as it progresses, they are engulfed by a thick fog and they miss out the mouth of the Ohio River, which would take them to a freer state. So, they lose track of where they are really going. As they move down the river, it is no longer a benevolent place to be in. As Huck and Jim move further south, they come across two people or two characters called the Duke and the Dauphin, which I will discuss in detail later on. And these people are con artists who trap Jim and who actually sell him away at a point of time, and Huck is forced to rescue Jim along with Tom. So the river does not really give them a kind of refuge that they were really searching. Earlier on, when they started their journey down the river, there was freedom, but as the novel progresses, they feel that it is not really a route to escape for them. As Huck and Jim's journey progresses down the river, they realize that it is only a short-term escape, but it does not really give them happiness. Huck and Jim further move towards danger, they move towards destruction. In the next module, we are going to read the beginning of this novel. It starts with a notice or an announcement. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn starts by familiarizing the readers with what happened in the novel that preceded it, that is, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Both the novels are set in St. Petersburg, which is on the banks of Mississippi River. Now, there are two friends, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. Now, these two at the very end of the novel Adventures of Tom Sawyer find a stash of gold from the robbers, but these people do not really get that money. It is put in the bank and they have got people who take care of them as custodians. So, Huckleberry Finn is now looked after by Widow Douglas, who lives with Miss Watson. Tom Sawyer is a very adventurous boy who thinks that life is nothing but a roller coaster ride. In comparison, Huck is his companion in most of his adventures. Tom Sawyer is a middle class boy with an imagination which is too active for his own good. As I said, that now Huckleberry Finn is looked after by Miss Watson, and Widow Douglas is extremely strict because she wants to civilize him, which of course she finds it very difficult because Huck finds her strict disciplinarian attitude very tiring and very difficult. So, a time comes when he wishes to escape and run away, but Tom dissuades him. Now, this novel, that is Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, starts with a notice sent by a man named Gigi, who is identified as a chief ordnance. The notice demands that no one should try to find motive, moral or plot in the novel, no pain of various sundry punishments, etc. The notice is followed by an explanatory note from the author which states that a lot of attention is paid in the book, which is extremely true to life and represents the vernacular tendencies of the individuals who were living along the banks of the Mississippi River in the year 1830s and 40s. It assures the reader that if he or she feels that the characters in the book are trying to talk alike but failing, then the reader is mistaken. The notice and the explanatory set the tone for the adventures of Huckleberry Finn through their mixing of humor as well as seriousness. So, the notice actually tells the readers that the novel is not written in the English that people in America were used to. This is where Mark Twain uses the dialect of the people that were living in Mississippi and the kind of English that was spoken. So, there is a regional color to the English that was spoken at that point of time, and this was introduced perhaps the first time in a novel. Let us now end this part of our lesson